Hi there, I'm Uncle Joel with Pin and Reel, and this is Star Wars 2020, a look back at the entire Skywalker saga. Okay, so we've finished going through each of the prequel movies one at a time, but now I want to take a look back at the prequel trilogy as a whole. So yeah, think about the trilogy as one comprehensive story, and then also just kind of analyze all three movies together. So to start with, I would say that they started out poor, and they improved, but never quite enough. There was poor acting throughout the entire prequel trilogy. Though it did steadily get better, it still was never great. But I attribute that primarily to Lucas's directing and his writing. For all of Lucas's strengths, he's just not a great director in my mind, and his scripts really needed a lot of work. I feel like this prequel trilogy proves that he has great ideas, and he has a lot of really good story ideas, but he's not great at implementing them. I feel like Lucas is best when paired with somebody else, where he comes up with a lot of ideas, and he contributes technologically and conceptually, where somebody else fleshes out his ideas, and they're the ones to actually implement them. There are just far too many ideas in this prequel trilogy that are really good. They're just not fleshed out well at all. And one of the key examples is the idea of the Chosen One. This whole prophecy surrounding a being who's supposed to bring balance to the Force. It could be a really good idea, but there is absolutely no exploration of it or even explanation of it. And while we've gotten more fleshed out in comic books, novels, and even the Clone Wars animated series, we really shouldn't need to go beyond the movies in order to understand the movies themselves. The trilogy as a whole felt very uneven, with the first movie feeling fairly inconsequential, almost like a prologue to the next two. And then between episodes 2 and episodes 3, episode 3 definitely carried a lot more of the narrative weight. So when you consider the trilogy as a whole, it's very uneven, with the first movie doing almost nothing for progressing the story, and the third movie doing the vast majority of the work. And I think one of the main disappointments about the prequel trilogy is so many people were hyped going into it thinking we're going to get the Clone Wars, especially since episode 2 is called Attack of the Clones. But we didn't really get the Clone Wars on the big screen. We got the start of it and the end of it, and everything in between was relegated to the animated series. I feel like that was a major missed opportunity. And then when you consider the villains of the series, I feel like there was a lot of missed opportunity there as well. So you consider Darth Maul, who had very little dialogue, and he pretty much just showed up, fought, and that was it. He was this very cool and interesting character who could have had a lot more going for him, but he just wasn't really utilized well. And Dooku, personally, I didn't find that interesting, at least not with the way he was portrayed in the movie. There are definitely things that could have been interesting, especially like his relationship with Yoda, but I feel like they didn't really explore that well, and for me, he was a very lackluster villain. And Grievous was interesting, but again, underutilized. I feel like one of the problems with the trilogy is they threw out a number of villains, didn't really build them up well, and then killed them off or moved them off the board too quickly. I feel like one of the strengths of the original series is having Darth Vader as this consistent villain throughout, even though they were building towards Palpatine being the ultimate villain. I feel like they could have done the same thing in the prequel trilogy and focused just on Darth Maul or just on Dooku. And maybe, bring Maul and Grievous in as sub-baddies, but have one consistent villain as the face of the enemy of the Jedi. And then I think it would have been far more crushing if they had one consistent villain throughout, and then they defeated him towards the end, only to find out that he was a red herring, that he wasn't the actual threat all along. And I think that's one of the points that really crushes me about the prequel trilogy, is it has a lot of really good ideas, and I do think it's telling a pretty decent story. It's not done well. With the bad script and the bad dialogue and just the poor pacing of everything, a lot of stuff not getting fleshed out as much as it deserves, I feel like there is a lot here that could have been great, but it just did not nail the landing at all. Now, that being said, for all of Lucas's flaws, he does understand basic storytelling and how to edit and assemble a solid movie. From a strictly technical standpoint, there's nothing wrong with these movies. It's just the directing and the acting and the implementation of the storytelling. So I feel like Lucas has a good grasp of things conceptually. It's just he doesn't really know how to follow through on it. So far with the first 3 movies in the Skywalker saga, I feel like they are edited well. They are assembled well from a strictly filmmaking standpoint. Not getting into story standpoint, but from a strictly filmmaking standpoint, I do think these are decent movies. But you cannot divorce the storytelling from the filmmaking, and it's the storytelling that is at issue. Personally, I would have loved it if Lucas came up with all of the ideas and all of the core story elements, but had somebody else come in and do the primary directing and actual implementation of his ideas. So with that in mind, honestly, I would love it if the prequel trilogy got remade. Give it to someone who has a deep love for Star Wars and Lucas's vision. Someone like, Dave Filoni, perhaps? And let them really build these movies into what they could have been and should have been. So yeah, I think the prequel trilogy had a lot going for it. It just was poorly implemented. So what would I do differently? Well, to be honest, I started writing out what I would do differently, and the further I went with it, the more and more it was turning into kind of a novel and me completely rewriting the prequel trilogy, which I don't want to get into that. I don't want to dive that deep unless people are interested. And if you're interested, let me know in the comments, and I will totally share everything that I came up with and maybe even come up with more. But for now, I want to keep it a bit more simple than that. So that being said, here's kind of the rough idea of what I would do differently to make the prequel trilogy a lot stronger while holding to the core of what Lucas was going for. At least what I believe he was going for. So to start with, we need a better understanding of what the prophecy of the Chosen One is. We need to show Qui-Gon Jinn's interest in it, and we need to show clearly and definitively why he thinks Anakin fits this role. So the first movie should focus quite a bit more on Qui-Gon's relationship with Anakin. And in that regard, you could almost have Qui-Gon have 2 Padawans and have it play out as almost a rivalry between Obi-Wan and Anakin in kind of a step-siblings vying for father's affections. Maybe Obi-Wan doesn't fully grasp, or at least isn't fully on board with the notion of the Chosen One. I think we should have a conflict with the Trade Federation invading Naboo, but condense it quite a bit. Remove the Gungans from the situation, have it primarily focus on the political situation and showing that the Republic isn't getting involved as much as they should, and show a dissension with the Jedi from their lack of involvement in this situation that is threatening an entire populace. And really show the dissension amongst the different planets and the fact that there are a lot of planets that are really considering leaving the Republic because they're not only losing faith in the Senate, but also in the Jedi. And establish in this first movie that Palpatine has an interest in Anakin. And establish in this first movie the threat of the droid army invading Naboo. And we can establish that Qui-Gon Jinn is going against the wishes of the Council and show both Obi-Wan and Anakin seeing that he is making the right decision, but coming to different conclusions about what that means. And then it would be in this first movie that we get Bail Organa showing up as an ally to Padme, which would be significant as showing him as a person that Obi-Wan would trust, leading to later on down the line when he would trust him with Leia. And alongside Bail Organa, we would also have Palpatine. We would show that he is kind of manipulating things from behind the scenes, but he is also working his way in with Padme and with Bail, trying to gain their trust, and he is the one that is developing the clone army. And we would introduce the clones in the first movie, so that the clones then are what come in and save Naboo, rather than the Gungans, which personally I would say leave the Gungans out entirely. I feel like they only muddy the situation. So then we would have the first movie establish the lore of the Chosen One. And we would also have the introduction of the clones. And we would go a long way to building the relationship between Qui-Gon and Anakin and Obi-Wan. And it would establish a lot of stuff that just really didn't get developed enough until the second movie. And one of the benefits of this is the second movie can then focus on the Clone Wars. And we can have one consistent villain throughout the entire trilogy, be it Dooku, who has his right-hand man, Darth Maul, or perhaps having Darth Maul be that central antagonist and the face of evil that the good guys are wanting to defeat. So in the second movie, really exploring the Clone Wars, we can jump around from planet to planet and show boots on the ground the conflict between the clones and the droids, and really show the complexity of the situation. There could be a lot that could be done to really sow the seeds of this maybe isn't necessarily as good as it seems, while giving the face of this is what everybody wants and needs. So different planets start rallying behind Palpatine and start really trusting him as the sole voice in the Republic that truly is trying to take action to protect them against this massive army of droids that is attacking and laying waste to the galaxy. And then we could get scenes like, on one planet where the droids are attacking and killing people indiscriminately, and the clones come in and wipe out the droids. But there's still a threat of more droids coming, so they occupy the city and establish martial law. And so in that way, we could see the seeds of, yes, they're coming in to save things, but maybe their intentions are not necessarily as good as what we think. And from there, we can expand much of what happens in episode 3 into part of episode 2 so that it doesn't feel as rushed and condensed all at the back end. Really show Palpatine manipulating Anakin. Really show that Palpatine is behind the war in both regards, and he's playing both sides against one another in order to grab control. Give more time to develop the manipulations. And one of the important elements for me would be really exploring Palpatine's time with Anakin. With Obi-Wan taking on the training of Anakin from Qui-Gon Jinn after Qui-Gon dies, we see kind of an uncomfortable relationship between him and Anakin. He really cares about Anakin, but it's clear that he's taking on his training more as a promise to Qui-Gon rather than he genuinely believes the prophecy of the Chosen One. Or maybe he learned from Qui-Gon enough about the Chosen One that he does start to see the same thing. And so after Qui-Gon dies, Obi-Wan starts training Anakin and kind of trying to play that father role, but Anakin doesn't really get that from him. Instead, he gets it more from Palpatine, who seems to care more about developing him emotionally, whereas the Jedi want him to repress his emotions. And so it would be important to have him spend quite a bit of time in communication with Palpatine, but maybe in such a way that Obi-Wan and the Jedi Council don't know about. And the more he spends time with Palpatine, the more distant Anakin gets with different people, to the point that he only really trusts Padme and Palpatine. But even Padme is starting to get distant from him because she sees the ways that he is becoming more and more angry and diving more into the dark side. And one of the key differences that I think would be important would be to have Padme leave earlier. She finds out that she's pregnant, and Obi-Wan helps her flee when Anakin is off with Palpatine. And then shortly after Padme leaves, both Anakin and Palpatine come back to Anakin's place to find Padme gone. And Anakin loses it. And Palpatine, close with him, being one of the few people that Anakin trusts, and now being the only person that Anakin trusts, Palpatine's able to manipulate him and push him emotionally to really drive him to feed on that anger. And he loses control and starts trashing the apartment. And it is here Palpatine convinces him, quit fighting the anger, give in to the anger. And Anakin says, I can't control myself. And Palpatine says, then don't. And Anakin goes crazy. See, one of the reasons that I think this is important is that Palpatine can tell him, you blacked out in this moment. You let your anger control you rather than you using your anger. And it was in that moment that you struck down Padme. You see, this for me would establish a solid point at which Palpatine can point back and say, that's when you killed your wife. Even though it didn't actually happen that way, I feel like this would be far more convincing than the line that we got in the actual movie, where it didn't really make sense exactly when it was supposed to take place. So just a quick side note. I don't know how I missed in my rewatch the scene where Anakin is choking Padme, so that clearly did establish a point in which he could have killed her. But still, I like my version a bit better. Yeah, I just wanted to quickly establish that there was a scene in the movie that could have been the point that Palpatine is referring to. But still, I'm not a big fan of how it played out. So from there, much of the third movie could play out pretty much in the way that it did in the version that we got, but they would have more time to explore it, and since some of the beats would have already taken place in the previous movie, we wouldn't feel so rushed, and it wouldn't be weighted onto the back end of the trilogy. And then another thing that I feel like would really be important here would be to establish that Obi-Wan and Anakin were close, but there was always a bit of dissension between them, and that divide grew more and more as Palpatine got involved. So that at the end, there wouldn't necessarily be the same kind of rage from Anakin towards Obi-Wan, but there would be a clear hatred and opposing opinions. Also, I think it would be very important to give Anakin some screen time as Vader. You know, establish that he has not only given into the dark side, but he has fully made the transition to this fully evil being, rather than just, okay, he got defeated by his master and now he's put into a suit. Like, no, give us an actual sequence of Vader going crazy and just letting loose. Like, have him leading the charge for Order 66. Have him slaughter multiple Jedi in his rage. Really show us that change, as opposed to, oh, now we know that's Darth Vader, the end. And ultimately, we need to see Anakin struggling from Episode 1 through to the end of Episode 3 when he finally gives in. We have to have reason for us to root for this character. Like, we have to be sympathetic with him. We have to like Anakin. We have to want him to have the relationship with Padme that the Jedi Council doesn't want him to have. Like, we need to really develop his character in such a way that he is sympathetic and that we really like him, so that when he finally turns to the dark side, it's tragic. Yes, there are plenty of us that already know that he's going to turn to the dark side, and so it might not be quite as effective for us. But for people who don't know that, for people who are coming into it, you know, especially like younger people who have never watched Star Wars before, if they start with the prequel trilogy, it should be devastating when Anakin turns to the dark side. That, I think, should be the core of the trilogy. We need to want Anakin to be good. We need to want him to succeed. And it should be devastating when he fails. So yeah, that's my rough thoughts on how the prequel trilogy should have been a bit different, but still keeping to the core of what Lucas was driving at. I think it would have been much better if we got things a bit more fleshed out, you know, more time with the Clone Wars, and really develop a connection with Anakin that we just didn't get from Lucas's scripts and his directing style. So yeah, overall, I would say I'm not a big fan of the prequel trilogy. I don't think I will want to watch it again, unless it's to get my future children into Star Wars. In which case, I will totally watch it with them. I will encourage them, and that would be very exciting for me. And for the way the prequel trilogy fits into the Skywalker saga as a whole, it's very important. I think it does a great job of building up Darth Vader and Palpatine and really establishing their place and their role in the entire saga. I just think there are a lot of ways that it could have been done much better. And that's about all that I have for right now. I hope you join us next time. I'm going to take a slight detour from the Skywalker saga and delve into Solo and Rogue One next. And then we'll get right back onto the Skywalker saga, diving into A New Hope. Until then, it's Uncle Joel saying, stay tangible.